Welcome to FEMA Flood Mapping Basics, a training course for New Hampshire community officials. In this course, you will learn about FEMA flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, flood insurance study reports, or FIS reports, that go with the FIRMs, letters of map change, or LOMCs, that amend or change the maps, how you can view these products, and where you can get help or more information if you need it. Let's get started. Flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, are produced for most communities that participate in FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. The NFIP is a voluntary program that communities across the country can choose to participate in. In New Hampshire, over 90% of communities participate. Communities that participate must adopt and enforce an ordinance that meets NFIP minimum requirements in order to manage development in areas that have a high risk of flooding, as shown on the FIRMs. Enforcing the floodplain ordinance ensures that when development does occur in areas with a high risk of flooding, it happens in a way that keeps future flood damage to a minimum and keeps people safe. NFIP flood insurance policies are available for purchase by any homeowner, renter, or business owner in a participating community, including those with property that is outside of a high-risk area on the FIRM. If a building is located in a high-risk area, a flood insurance policy will be required by the lender as a condition of a mortgage or other federally backed loan on the property. Keep in mind that lower risk areas can and do flood, so flood insurance is highly recommended in those places too. Today, FEMA creates FIRMs that include all municipalities in one county on one set of maps and FIS reports. In areas where the maps are quite old, like in Belknap County, each separate community has its own set of maps and a separate FIS report. FEMA periodically updates the maps and the flood hazard information they include when funding is available. Older maps are converted to a digital countywide format when that happens. You can learn more about FEMA flood mapping projects underway in New Hampshire on the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives Floodplain Management Program website. The FIRMs are used by different people for different purposes. For example, they are used by local community officials to determine where and how the community floodplain ordinance will apply for new development. They are used by lenders or companies that work for lenders to determine if a building must have a flood insurance policy as a condition of a loan. They are used by insurance agents to help determine the cost of a flood insurance policy for a building. And they're also used by members of the public who are interested in understanding what the risk from flooding in their area is. It's important to understand the limitations of the FIRMs. In real life, floods do not follow lines on maps. The floodplains shown on the FIRMs are based on the results of a computer model simulating where floodwaters will go and how high floodwaters will rise to for a flood that has a 1% chance of happening in a given year. This is a best estimate of what may happen during such a flood based on the best information currently available. Another thing to consider is that floods more severe than the flood levels shown on the FIRM can and will happen. Besides this, stormwater and local drainage issues are usually not considered when preparing the FIRMs. Also, future effects of climate change, including future sea level rise, and changes in precipitation patterns are not included on the maps. For these reasons, communities should consider adopting requirements into their floodplain ordinance that go beyond the minimum NFIP standards to ensure people and property are kept safe from floods. More information about these higher standards is available on OSI's website. The maps for your community may look a little different from other communities in the state, depending on when the maps were made and how you view them, but they all show similar things, which we'll go over next. During this training, we'll include examples of older and newer maps as illustrations. The firms show areas that are expected to be affected by a flood that statistically has a 1% chance of happening in any given year based on computer model results. This level of flood is sometimes called the 100-year flood or the base flood. Sometimes people mistakenly think that a flood of this size will only happen once every 100 years. In fact, there is a chance that such a flood could happen in back-to-back years, or even more than once in the same year. The boundary of the 1% annual chance flood is what is shown on the firm. This boundary is called the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. The SFHA is made up of different flood zones that start with the letter A or V. We'll talk more about those later on. On newer maps, SFHAs have blue shading. On older black and white maps, they are shaded gray. Also shown on the firms in some areas are base flood elevations, or BFEs. BFEs show the height that the 1% annual chance flood is expected to rise to when a flood of that size happens. But keep in mind that a BFE is not the actual depth of the floodwaters. Here's why. BFEs and any other kind of elevation information are referenced to what is called a vertical datum. The vertical datum establishes a zero starting point for elevation data. In New Hampshire, depending on where you are in the state, the BFEs on your community's firm may use either the NGVD 29 or NAVD 88 vertical datums. Let's say you have a BFE for a particular property of 16 feet that is referenced to the NAVD 88 vertical datum. In order to find out the depth of the flooding, you would need to know the ground elevation in the area referenced to the same vertical datum and subtract it from the BFE. So if the ground elevation is 12 feet, then the expected depth of the flooding at that location during the 1% annual chance flood would be 4 feet. The important thing to remember about vertical datums is that if you need to compare elevations from different sources, they need to be in the same vertical datum. The firm panels and the flood insurance study reports that go with them clearly state which vertical datum applies for the BFEs in the area. BFEs are shown on the firms for certain flood zones only. We'll talk more about these different flood zones next. As mentioned previously, the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA, is made up of flood zones that start with the letter A or V. The specific flood zone affects which requirements in your community floodplain ordinance will apply for proposed development. For flood insurance, the flood zone is one of the factors in how much the premium for a particular building will cost. Let's review the different flood zones shown on the firms. Zone AE is part of the SFHA where FEMA has developed base flood elevations and included them on the firms and in the FIS report. You can find AE zones in both inland areas along rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds, and in coastal areas too. On older maps, AE zones may instead be labeled with the letter A, followed by a number from 1 through 40. For some rivers and streams that have AE zones along them, there are areas shown on the firm that are called floodways. The floodway is the part of the SFHA where the most dangerous, fastest moving water will flow during a 1% annual chance flood. For this reason, NFIP communities have more restrictive requirements in their floodplain ordinances for development proposed in a floodway. Floodways are not features you can see on the ground. The boundaries are drawn based on computer model results as part of the flood hazard analyses performed to develop the flood zone boundary and base flood elevations. Floodway symbology on the maps looks a little different depending on when they were produced. Also, for communities with maps produced in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, the floodway may be shown on a separate set of maps from the firm called Flood Boundary and Floodway Maps, or FBFMs. Something else you will see on the firms along streams with AE zones and a floodway are cross-sections. Cross-sections are field-surveyed locations along the stream. Information from these locations was included in the flood hazard analyses used to develop the flood zone and floodway boundaries and base flood elevations. There's more information available about each of the cross-section locations in the flood insurance study reports that accompany the firms. We'll talk more about those reports later on. The coastal A zone is formed from part of the AE flood zone in some areas near the seacoast. These are areas where wave heights between 1.5 and 3 feet are expected during a 1% annual chance flood. The inland limit of the coastal A zone is shown on the firms as the limit of moderate wave action, or LIMWA. The LIMWA is a black line with triangles that point in the direction of the area of the coastal A zone. Because even moderate wave effects, such as those found in coastal A zones, can cause a heightened level of damage during a flood, there are special building requirements that are included in the New Hampshire State Building Code that apply in these areas. A zones are also part of the SFHA. However, in these areas, FEMA has not developed base flood elevations because a detailed flood hazard analysis was not performed. FEMA has a limited mapping budget and must prioritize the most development-prone areas for the detailed analyses. However, for future FEMA mapping projects, all new and updated Zone A floodplains will be based on highly detailed topographic information and a limited form of analysis. AO zones are part of the SFHA where there is shallow flooding that may be anywhere from 1 foot to 3 feet in depth. The depth of flooding that applies in AO zones is usually listed on the firm. Again, you can find AO zones in both inland and coastal areas. VE zones are parts of the SFHA along the coast where the added damaging effects from waves 3 feet or higher are expected during a 1% annual chance flood. Coastal communities that have VE zones have more restrictive building requirements for development in those areas because of the added risk of damage from the wave action. For the same reason, flood insurance rates in VE zones are usually higher than in other areas. Like AE zones, base flood elevations are shown on the firms in VE zones. VE zones are also known as the coastal high hazard area. Any areas on the firms outside of the SFHA are called Zone X. Zone X areas are not subject to the requirements of your community's floodplain ordinance unless your community has adopted requirements that go beyond the minimum NFIP standards. Flood insurance is not required for a building as a condition of a mortgage or other loan in Zone X areas. The 0.2% annual chance, or 500-year floodplain, which is part of Zone X, is included on the firms for informational purposes. These areas have an increased risk from flooding, but not as high as in the SFHA. On older firms, Zone X areas may instead be labeled Zone B and Zone C, with Zone B the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. On newer firms, Zone X areas aren't labeled with text. They are simply the areas with no blue shading. In this example, the 0.2% annual chance floodplain is shown with orange shading. Community officials need to understand how to use the firms in order to properly enforce their community's floodplain ordinance. For example, you as a community official must determine whether or not a proposed development site is located in the SFHA. If it is, that means the requirements of your community's floodplain ordinance will apply. If the site is located in the SFHA, you will also need to know which flood zone applies. For AE zones, whether or not the site is also located in a floodway, and the BFE that applies. These things will determine which requirements in the ordinance apply and how they apply. Your community can require applicants to provide this information as part of a permit application. However, a community official must verify that the information provided is accurate. A flood insurance study report, or FIS report, is developed by FEMA as a companion document to each set of firms. It contains technical details about the flood hazard analyses used to develop the maps, information about flooding problems in the community, and more. Some of the most important information included in the report is related to base flood elevations. Notice that the firms show the BFEs rounded to the whole foot. However, in the FIS report, there are tables and charts that have more precise values, rounded to the 10th of a foot. So, for example, the value on the map may be 486 feet, but in the FIS report, the same value is 486.4 feet. In most cases, for AE zones, the FIS report value should be used as the BFE value for the purposes of enforcing your community floodplain ordinance. Let's look at the different charts and tables in the FIS report that include BFE information. Each stream or river with a Zone AE floodplain will have a set of flood profiles in the FIS report that show BFE values along the watercourse. You'll see that other flood frequency levels, for example, the elevation of the 0.2% annual chance or 500-year flood, are also included on the profiles. To use the flood profile to get the BFE for a particular site along a stream, first check the legend to identify the line that shows the BFE values. It will say either 1% annual chance flood, or if the report is older, 100-year flood. Then you will need to locate a reference point shown on both the firm panel and the flood profile. For example, you could use a bridge crossing or a cross-section. Let's use cross-section E in this example. Measure the distance along the streamline on the firm from the reference point to the most upstream point of the proposed development site. Then measure the same distance from that reference point on the profile and look at the vertical scale to get the BFE value. For a stream or river that has a Zone AE floodplain and also a floodway, you can instead use the Floodway Data Table, or FDT, to get the BFE value if the site is located right at a cross-section line on the firm. Look in the regulatory column of the table to get the BFE value for the cross-section that applies. For ponds, lakes, and for some coastal areas that have AE zones shown, you can use the Summary of Stillwater Elevations table to get the BFE by finding the flooding source in the table and then looking in the 1% annual chance or 100-year flood elevation column of the table. For AE zones near the seacoast, you should check both the BFE on the firm panel and the BFE included in the Summary of Stillwater Elevations table, and use the higher of the two. That's because oftentimes coastal AE zones include wave effects that are not reflected in the elevations in the Summary of Stillwater Elevations table. However, the wave effects are accounted for in the BFEs shown on the maps. For VE zones, or the coastal high hazard area, there will always be wave effects involved. Therefore, you should always use the BFE value shown on the firm for VE zones. If you are not sure how to determine the correct BFE for a particular site, use the resources mentioned at the end of this training course to get help. A letter of map change, or LOMAC, is a letter from FEMA which makes an official change to part of an affected firm panel. Different types of LOMACs serve different purposes. Let's take a closer look at two of the most common types. Sometimes, due to the scale of the maps, or for other reasons, a property may be inadvertently mapped in the SFHA, even though it is actually on high ground above the BFE in the area, and therefore outside of the SFHA. A letter of map amendment, or LOMA, officially amends the effective firm to remove a structure, a lot, or a portion of a lot from the SFHA. Usually, a licensed land surveyor is needed to provide the elevation information that must be included in most LOMA applications. If a LOMA is issued that removes a building from the SFHA, a lender typically will no longer require a flood insurance policy for the building as a condition of a mortgage or other loan. FEMA provides copies of LOMA documents to communities as they are issued. These documents should be kept in your community property files. Most LOMAs are also available for download from FEMA's Map Service Center website, which we'll talk about later on. Unlike a LOMA, a letter of map revision, or LOMAR, physically revises a portion of one or more firm panels, and if necessary, portions of the FIS report. LOMARs are used to make changes to the firm based on revised flood hazard analyses that reflect the impacts of a major project in the SFHA. For example, the replacement of a bridge or a culvert, or the addition or removal of a dam. Usually, the process to physically revise whole firm panels takes multiple years to complete. LOMARs, are an alternative, faster way for these updates to be performed when the changes affect a relatively small area of a community. Let's go over the different ways you can view the firms, FIS reports, and LOMCs. Your community should have paper copies of the firms and FIS reports available in the community office for review by staff and interested residents. Some communities also provide information online, often adding the FEMA flood hazard boundaries as a layer in their online tax map viewers. There are other ways that you can access the maps and reports online through websites developed by FEMA and the state. Let's take a closer look at some of these different resources. You can view and download effective firms for any community using FEMA's Flood Map Service Center, or MSC. To get the flood hazard information for your area, type in an address or community name into the search box on the main page. For all communities that have digitally produced firms, the flood hazard information from the maps will appear directly on the screen. To create a printable mini-map called a firmette of your area of interest, click on the Dynamic Map button after zooming into the location. In New Hampshire, all NFIP communities except for those in Belknap County and the town of Lincoln in Grafton County currently have digitally produced maps. The process to view information from firms that were not digitally produced is slightly different. After typing in the address, click on either the View Print Firm or Download Firm Panel button. This will take you to a scanned copy of the map panel. You will then need to find the location of your site on the map panel yourself. Let's go back to the search results screen. If you click on Show All Products, this will take you to a list of all mapping products available for a community. From here, you can access effective firm panels and FIS reports, preliminary versions of firm panels and FIS reports that have not yet been finalized, historic firms and FIS reports that have been superseded by newer products, GIS datasets, and letters of map change. Communities with digitally produced maps have another option from FEMA to view the firms, the National Flood Hazard Layer, or NFHL, viewer. The NFHL viewer has more capabilities than the viewer on the MSC main page. For example, you can measure distances on the screen, create firmettes directly in the viewer, or download entire map panels, LOMAs, or GIS data. Another way that you can view information from digitally produced firms is the New Hampshire Flood Hazards Viewer. This online viewer was developed by OSI and contains the exact same flood hazard information as the FEMA map viewers. However, it also includes local map layers too. For example, tax parcel boundaries are shown for many communities in the state. Sea level rise scenario information is available along the seacoast, and 2-foot topographic contour elevation data is included for the entire state. You can also turn layers on and off, measure distances on the screen, and in areas where preliminary firms have been issued, You can use the swipe tool to compare the effective and preliminary flood hazard information. Let's review some key points we've covered during this training course. NFIP communities must adopt and enforce a floodplain ordinance that meets minimum NFIP requirements in order to manage development in special flood hazard areas, or SFHAs. Therefore, it's important that community officials understand how to use the FEMS and Flood Insurance Study Report in order to properly enforce their community's floodplain ordinance. Letters of map amendment, or LOMAs, and letters of map revision, LOMRs, are different ways that FEMA can officially change the FEMS for smaller areas. The FEMS can be accessed in a few different ways, including in paper format at the community office, through the FEMA Map Service Center website, which also provides access to the flood insurance study reports and LOMACs, and for communities with digitally produced maps, FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer and the New Hampshire Flood Hazards Viewer are other options. To learn more about the topics we've covered, visit OSI's Floodplain Management Program website and download our NFIP Resources Fact Sheet, which includes links to the resources mentioned during this training course, plus many more. If you have questions, the OSI Floodplain Management Team is available to help. Telephone and email contact information is also on our website. And FEMA's Mapping and Insurance Exchange is another great resource for questions about the FEMS and FIS reports, LOMACs, and flood insurance too. Thank you for watching FEMA Flood Mapping Basics, a production of the New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives.